Bienvenidos a este A Fondo. Hoy tenemos de invitado a un profesor que además ha estado muy cercano en una universidad que nosotros queremos mucho, la Universidad de los Andes. Él acaba de ser galardonado con el premio Nobel de Economía, junto con sus otros tres economistas amigos, Daron, Acemoglu y Jonhson. Bienvenido aquí a fondo, James Robinson.
Gracias.
Voy a hacer, para que ustedes nos entiendan cómo va a ser el sistema aquí de la entrevista, yo voy a hacer las preguntas en español y James las va a responder en inglés y ustedes van a poder entender lo que dicen a través de los subtítulos. Comenzamos. James, si hay alguien que conoce muy bien Colombia, eres tú. Y has venido estudiando, de hecho, en todos sus trabajos que han sido ahora premiados, que tienen que ver con el desarrollo de las instituciones y el crecimiento económico, esa relación intrínseca. Colombia sigue siendo pues un país para comparar. Y lo hiciste en el libro de ¿Por qué fracasan las naciones? Y los vienen haciendo ustedes en los otros libros que han desarrollado. Para comenzar esta entrevista, ¿cómo dirías tú que le pasa? O sea, ¿cuál puede ser el paisaje o la forma para explicar qué es lo que sucede en Colombia cuando hablamos de instituciones y de un tema que es evidente y es la no presencia del Estado en todas las regiones de Colombia?
Yeah, I think that's fundamental. I think the relationship between the state and society that developed in Colombia really in the 19th century is sort of fundamental for understanding many other things. You know, it's fundamental for understanding kind of poverty, inequality, the enormous lack of kind of services and infrastructure and, you know, basic things that the state should be doing, security. And it's fundamental for understanding a lot of the economic institutions also, because for me, you know, many of the economic problems come from the ability of economic elites to manipulate a weak state in their favor. So I think I would start exactly by trying to think about the construction of the Colombian state. And I think one of the things that I've studied, you know, is the kind of mechanisms, the political mechanisms that keep that trapped. You know, like why is it that the state can't get stronger or there's no political momentum to make the state stronger? Well, that's a combination of many different incentives and mechanisms. And I think one of the things I've tried to do is to just kind of investigate and kind of clarify those mechanisms and how they work.
¿Y cuál crees tú que pueden ser las 5 o 6 razones importantes de que en Colombia históricamente no hayamos podido salir de esta trampa que es que no hemos podido construir lo que se llama un Estado-nación? No sé si eso es lo que se puede decir que deberíamos construir. You are the expert.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think you know, I would start with the 1863 Constitution, the Rio Negro Constitution, that really sort of reached this pact of like, we're not really going to build a central state, you know, and there's going to be chaos and probably violence, but we can adjust to that. We kind of live with it. We solve it through peace treaties. This is the so-called famous derecho de gentes. This is the clause that Camacho Roldan wrote and put in the Rio Negro Constitution, you know, which was reconfirmed by the conservatives, you know, after the regeneration. And it stayed in the Constitution until 1991. This clause which basically said, you know, there's going to be violence, and you know, but that's okay. We have peace treaties. We forgive people, and so they never built a central state. And I think whenever there was violence and problems, a state building project never emerged. Instead, they kind of adjusted, like the voto completo, like after the War of 1,000 Days. Yeah. There was so much corruption, they couldn't really run elections. So what did they do? Did they build institutions to eliminate corruption? No. They said, okay, fine, we split the seats. You get 50, we get 50. You get 50% of the positions in the bureaucracy, we get 50%. And then in 1950, no, sorry, it was 2/3, 1/3 in 1905. In 1958, it was 1/2, 1/2. Same thing, civil war, violence. Do we build a state? No. Let's just split power and try to... So that was the elites kind of dividing the pie, but there was never a plan to kind of integrate the country or like really build institutions. And I think, like, for me, many things in Colombia flow from that, you know. And of course that had many unintended consequences, you know, like in the 1970s when the drug industry took off, you know, and Rodriguez Gacha and Pablo Escobar brought the coca up from Peru and Bolivia, and they planted Tranquilandia and they built airfields. And so that was unintended, you know. But how did they cope with that? They tried to make a deal, you know, they tried to like negotiate that. And in the end, you couldn't negotiate with Pablo Escobar. So he had to be killed, you know. Yeah. But there's always this idea of we never really build institutions to deal with this. We kind of negotiate, or we split the pie somehow. You know, Pablo Escobar appears on like as a suplente on a liberal list for Congress. This is trying to adjust. And then it turned out you couldn't adjust to Pablo Escobar, you know.
So you just wiped out the problem by killing.
Yeah, so you couldn't, you know, it's like Osama bin Laden. You can't adjust to Osama bin Laden. You know, there's only one solution to that. So I think, like, but there you see this reticence in Colombia, you know, to build institutions. And I think that got like completely socialized into the society. You know, for example, in the 1970s, when they rewrote the penal codes, and they had to decide, these judges and lawyers had to decide, you know, what did the penal codes do? The discussion is amazing. It's sort of like, well, you know, when civil war starts, people get killed and buildings get destroyed and there's violence. And, you know, it would really not be appropriate to punish people for things that happen in the course of a civil war. You know, the idea of kind of violence and conflict just became completely normalized as the Colombian way of life by the 1970s. But for me, that starts in 1863, where you accept that violence is going to be there and conflict, and you just agree to negotiate and have peace treaties and demobilizations, you know, the country of demobilizations.
Yeah, because porque hemos tenido cantidades de desmovilizaciones. Creo que somos el país que más desmovilizaciones y acuerdos con grupos armados, digamos, de la región, sin duda, ¿no es verdad? Entonces, con este panorama que tú estás planteando, digamos, lo que estás diciendo es que digamos, lo que hemos logrado para, digamos, que la manera como se gobierna en Colombia es a través de dos cosas: es ver cómo se logra disminuir la violencia, no acabarla, sino disminuir la violencia, mientras que se reparte el poder. Esa es como la manera como se negocia el poder en Colombia. Y las instituciones, pues realmente no aparecieron. Eso es lo que tú dices. ¿Qué ocurre cuando, por ejemplo, se firma la Constitución de 1991? ¿Hay algún cambio en este modelo que tú traes? No.
I think that was an attempt to adjust. You know, it was an attempt to try to move resources out of the center into the kind of periphery. I mean, I think it's important to understand, you know, the form that politics took in Colombia, you know, that without institutions, without a strong central state, you know, how did politics work? Politics worked in a very personalized way, you know, very clientelistic through negotiations and kind of social networks in the traditional party system. And so that you know, that persists to this day, of course, that very clientelistic way of operating, very personalized. And I think the 1991, I think what you see is when there are crises, you know, there are attempts to kind of reconfigure things. You know, after la violencia, you know, the juntas de acción comunal were introduced, you know, to try to strengthen local democracy or local social capital, or to do something, you know. There was investment in education after la violencia also. There was an attempt to do agrarian reform under Carlos Lleras. It never worked, but there was some attempt to kind of change the underlying thing, but it always fails in Colombia. It always fails. There's maybe a little progress, and I think I see about, the election of mayors in the 1980s, the 1991 constitution. There's a little progress, recognizing the property rights of Afro-Colombians. That was a great thing, moving some resources into the periphery, that was a good thing, but it didn't solve the fundamental weakness of the central state or the way that politics functioned for me, and of course, indeed, even after that, you have the rise of paramilitarism, you have paramilitaries fixing 1/3 of the elections, you have Salvatore Mancuso addressing Congress, and, so that is evidence of how kind of the problem persisted.
Claro, uno pensaba, y eso sí es cierto, que cuando en 1991 hicimos la Constitución, pensábamos que esa era la Constitución que nos iba a salvar para crear precisamente un Estado fuerte en el que pues democráticamente se pudiera sacar adelante un país. Y nos vino la peor era de violencia que hayamos podido tener los colombianos en el siglo pasado. Eso es cierto. Pero entonces, ¿qué pasa cuando llega Álvaro Uribe? Porque yo creo que uno de los problemas, y eso es una cosa que ustedes han estudiado mucho y que tú has estudiado mucho en Colombia, es que aquí criticamos mucho a Gustavo Petro de que no logra realmente implementar, pero si hay algo que ha tenido casi todos los gobiernos, y tú lo acabas de decir, es que por más de que intenten, no lo logran, no implementan. Hay un problema de implementación muy grave. ¿Qué pasa cuando llega Álvaro Uribe? Porque Álvaro Uribe es como un outsider de la política y algo cambia.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting moment, like in the sense that, Carlos Lleras in the late 1960s, he really sort of he tried to implement things, especially agrarian reform, facilitating the creation of ANUC. But I think what I find interesting about President Uribe is like he was focused on one thing and he really had a strategy, Like I remember, being at Los Andes when this open up the roads happened. The day President Uribe won the election, he went up to Valledupar to open the roads. Then he went to Florencia, to open the roads. And the police, the army were on the roads with like the thumb up. And you think it's sort of silly, but actually everyone was talking about it. One of my friends drove to like Santa Marta for the weekend just because you could for the first time in, 10 years. It was safe to drive to Santa Marta. And there was a strategy, there was that notion of like sequencing. These consejos comunales, every weekend, every Saturday, he'd take the ministers to some place in the middle of some municipality where the Colombian president had never been before, ever in 200 years. And of course that was patronage, but it was also state building. It was taking the state somewhere it had never been before. So I think, what I think was interesting about President Uribe is that he actually had a strategy and he showed what could be achieved if you actually made an effort to achieve something, And of course, he only cared about one thing. He was perfectly happy to corrupt institutions and, try to kind of keep himself in power forever. And, and so it was just that he really cared about defeating the FARC and he wanted to make that happen, but again, you sort of see what a lost opportunity that was. As soon as President Santos came in, it's like politics as usual. Is he going to waste his time on Saturday in San Jose de Guaviare when he could be playing golf or, whatever? No, like it stops completely. The whole thing stops, and so that shows how kind of stable the traditional politics is. Like President Uribe demonstrates what can be done and everything goes into reverse completely.
And una de las cosas que escuchándote me pregunto yo y es que la reelección, es la reelección, porque aquí la reelección también es un problema, ha sido un problema para generar violencia desde los tiempos de atrás, del pasado, pero en este caso hay mucha gente, Uribe lo decía, y el propio Juan Manuel Santos también, que la reelección era necesaria para poder cambiar este país y que por eso se aprobó esta reelección y que esos cambios que tú lo estás señalando se dieron porque hubo reelección. La reelección no existe hoy en Colombia.
No, I think
¿Eso tiene que ver algo?
Yeah, I think, there's a political culture, there's a deep political culture of not allowing re-election in Colombia, like in other places, like Mexico, for example, since 1930. And I think, if you look at, I don't think there's re-election is critical or not critical. The problem in Latin America generally is politics is too personalized. So everybody thinks it's just about themselves and only they can save the country. But actually, it takes a movement. It takes institutions to save a country, not individuals. So there's no reason why the project could not have continued, if President Uribe had left power after 4 years, as he was supposed to before he changed the constitution. I think it would have continued, and it's the same now. If President Petro leaves in 4 years, his project can continue, and he has to show to people that he's making real progress and they can grasp a better future and they will re-elect his candidate. So I don't think re-election is so crucial, honestly.
Oh, okay. So, entonces, ¿qué pasa cuando llega Juan Manuel Santos, que además llega pues amparado con el poder que tenía Uribe, el caudal de votos que tenía Uribe? Juan Manuel Santos decide hacer un acuerdo de paz con las FARC. Otra de las tantas desmovilizaciones se producen, pero que es importante, yo sí creo que fue muy importante. ¿Qué significó para el país ese momento de Juan Manuel Santos en términos de en términos de construcción de instituciones?
I think that was a great thing. I think it's a great thing that the FARC are demobilized and they're not kidnapping and murdering people. And I never understood why President Uribe just doesn't claim the credit for that. He should just claim the credit for it. He should say that wouldn't have happened without me. That's what he should have done. Anyway, but, was that a moment to build institutions? Yeah, maybe, but I don't think it happened. I think that was probably the plan, of elements of the peace agreement, the paz territorial. The paz territorial was trying to kind of solve this problem of, building trust in institutions, moving the state into the periphery. But for me, that's a political project, that was a political project. When President Uribe decided that was going to happen, it happened, So you need somebody with, who makes that their political project. But I don't think that President Santos was just he, on the one hand, he was supporting Sergio Jaramillo, in one wing of the Palacio Nariño. And in the other wing, he was negotiating with Musa Besai to give jobs, that's a totally inconsistent way of operating. You can't have both peace in this country with Musa Besai type politics. Sorry, that's just the fact.
Y eso nos lleva a otro tema que tú has estudiado mucho y es el clientelismo, el papel del clientelismo como conector, por lo demás, entre la política del centro, digamos, porque eso sí hay, política de centro, no Estado, pero política de centro, y el territorio, lo que se llaman ahora, o las regiones. Has esclarecido que hay un papel fundamental que conecta, pero que es perverso y que no sirve para construir instituciones.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that the way that politics has functioned in Colombia and still functions, is fundamentally opposed to the creation of institutions. And, there has to be, that's why I'm sort of pointing out that this traditional way of managing politics, during the Santos government was completely inconsistent with a bigger agenda towards improving institutions. And I still think, people still don't get that. The political class still operates that way. And, how one changes that, I don't know. I think in the past there have been attempts to change it. But President Uribe, I don't know. I think that's a very difficult problem. I think that's for me, that's the way that politics works. That's the fun, as I said, to build state and institutions, that has to be a political project. But clientelism just fundamentally gets in the way of that project happening. President Uribe could override that in some dimensions if he really cared enough. And because he was so popular, he didn't care so much about buying votes or whatever, or managing all of that. But how to turn that moment into something bigger, how to convert now the kind of aspirations or the ambition for change in this country into a non-clientelistic political project that really build institutions. I don't see.
Entonces llegamos a este momento. Muchos dicen, profesor Robinson, que lo que sucedió en el 2016 con la firma del acuerdo de paz es que de alguna manera eso sirvió para abrir las compuertas de una sociedad que estaba cerrada, que siempre ha estado cerrada, que gobiernen los mismos de siempre. Y entonces eso de alguna manera posibilita que la gente que no tenía, pensado que podría llegar a ser presidente y que era de izquierda, llegara. Y que eso es un poco lo que sucede con Gustavo Petro. Se desata una necesidad de cambio que es muy parecida a la de tantas épocas atrás que se desatan como cada vez entre cierto tiempo y sube por primera vez un presidente de izquierda en un país donde la izquierda nunca había podido llegar al poder, nunca en su historia republicana. ¿Qué significó eso? Y si eso realmente tiene algo que ver con creaciones de instituciones democráticas, porque uno dice, nos volvimos un poco ya más maduros, la democracia, pero le pregunto, ¿cómo se entiende eso?
Yeah, I mean, my perspective on President Petro is, for the first time ever, Colombia actually has a president who thinks there are problems in this country. I mean, it's always been staggering to me, since I first came here, that the country, in a place like Colombia, which is basically a disaster, is run by people who think it's a kind of success story, that Colombia is just like, and that is bizarre to me. I think it speaks something, of course, to the kind of Bogota bubble and the extent to which people are completely out of touch with what goes on in the rest of the country. Why is that? Because politics is managed through El Nogal or the club or whatever, and so you don't really have to deal with the reality. I mean, again, that was something about President Uribe. He was happy to throw Ruana on and go and meet the campesinos. That's unusual,
Sí.
That's unusual. So of course, President Petro, he's an activist, so he does that too, So I think that's good. And I don't know about left and right. Honestly, I don't find left and right, I don't think this is about left and right.
Okay.
It's not about left and right. It's not about, for me, you can have honest disagreements about left and right, and what we want to do, what policies we want to have. Do we want to have more markets? Do we want to have more state? Do we want to have more redistribution? But I think this is just about fundamental things that everybody should agree on in this country, whether they're from the left or the right. They should agree on,
health.
Yeah, absolutely. Integrating, building a road to Quibdó, for heaven's sake, that should be running water in Rio Hacha, or La Guajira, or just that's not a left-wing or a right-wing issue. It's just a fundamental thing that every Colombian should have rights to, and everyone should be in favor of that and figuring out how to make it happen in this country. So I think that's great, but he has to overcome, he has lots of problems, because there's lots of people who are not going to be on that, who don't want that, who are too comfortable, who are still thinking Colombia's a success story, or what's in it for me kind of thing, so he has to deal with that, and I understand that's difficult, but he has a lot of power. He's a president. This is a presidential system. He can do lots of things, as president, and he has to figure out, how do I find a path so that in 30 years' time, when I'm away, retired, wherever I am, in Chia or something, then this country is different. And I can be proud of what I contributed to that. And it's not about him, and it's not about 4 years. It's about a generation. I think if you look at societies that have gone through these radical transformations like Korea or Taiwan, many other places, it takes 30 years, for that. Chile, for example, it's 30 years, since the dictatorship went. And Chile has been transformed in 30 years. It took 30 years. It didn't take 4 years or 8 years. So that's, what's the plan to get there? And that's about building institutions, because how do you leave a legacy? You have to build institutions to have a legacy,
En una entrevista que yo le hice a Gustavo Petro, siendo ya presidente, yo le pregunté que cómo se sentía en el poder y me dijo que él no había llegado al poder porque el poder lo tenían otros. Ese otros, pues, era el poder económico y que realmente el poder que él tenía era muy pequeño. Eso causó cierto escozor. La frase, pues no escozor, pero sí hubo un impacto porque realmente los gobiernos aquí son muy fuertes. El presidente es muy fuerte. La pregunta va dirigida a que si eso es realmente un nuevo episodio en Colombia, el hecho de que haya un presidente que de todas formas viene de un lugar donde pues no, digamos, de un sitio o de un sitio político que no estaba en el poder, si eso cambia un poco las relaciones con las élites tradicionales, o si es la oportunidad para que entren nuevas élites.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I would new elites.
New elites.
Probably. I think, I think it's a moment where traditional elites in Colombia lose a lot of their power and influence and say over the society, and that's a great thing. People who've never had a voice and they never had a seat at the table, can now talk about what they want in Colombia. That's a great thing, and so there needs to be a reconfiguration of the society and the relationship between the elites and people. I don't know that we need new elites. Maybe there's always elites. There's theories in sociology which would suggest that. But I think also that what this country needs is economic development. Economic growth. Like I always said, if you go back 170 years. Income per capita in this country was 20% of the level in the United States, and 170 years later, it's still 20% of income per capita in the United States. And in the meantime, the absolute difference got larger and larger and larger, and there's no reason for that. There's no reason for that other than the way institutions have been organized in this country. That's the sad thing. So to make Colombians wealthy, to get rid of poverty, to do something about inequality, it needs some strategy for economic growth and economic development. And that's going to involve everybody, including elites, because a lot of the elites have the education, they have the capital, they have the international connections. I think every successful experience of economic development, whether you look at, South Korea, you look at Taiwan, you look at China, you look historically at the United States or England, wherever it is, you need everyone. You need the private sector, you need the government, but they have the expertise. So they need to reconfigure that relationship. And of course, traditional elites have to come to terms with the fact that they're living in a different country now. but they need to understand that this could be something incredible for them too, and they won't have to go to Miami or Dallas to get vaccinated for COVID. They'd actually be able to get vaccinated for COVID in Colombia.
Entonces, ¿tú crees que de alguna manera la llegada de Gustavo Petro, después hablamos del efecto en el gobierno, pero la llegada de Gustavo Petro sí le plantea una situación distinta a la clase dirigente tradicional colombiana? ¿Sí hay algo que hay que entender o que es un mensaje para la clase tradicional política o no?
Well, I think you have to figure out what that relationship looks like. I think they're so used to kind of preferential access. They're so used to kind of opting out of the society. You self-provide education, you self-provide healthcare, you self-provide security. When you need vaccination for COVID, you take a plane to Miami. You're so divorced from Colombia and the realities of Colombian society, and that, it seems to me, has to change in order to kind of identify more with the problems that real Colombians face.
Uh-huh. Y uno de los problemas que yo creo que muchos le reclaman a Gustavo Petro es que esté gobernando con los mismos métodos, de todas formas, que gobernaron nosotros, porque si no tiene la mayoría en el Congreso para poder pasar sus proyectos y sus leyes, ha recurrido al clientelismo.
Yeah.
¿Eso te parecía a ti que iba a pasar o de pronto No lo pensaste.
Yeah, I can see the frustration and the difficulty with that. But I think, if you look around, think about what happened with the Workers' Party in Brazil, something very similar. When the Workers' Party came to power, Lula didn't have, Dilma didn't have a majority. How did they pass legislation? They started bribing people. They started engaging in. What happened to that? It led down a slippery slope, which undermined the project of the government, and it ended up with President Rousseff being impeached. So I think they have to resist that. That's the whole problem. You can't operate like that. You have to show people that there's a different way of operating. That means, okay, you can't get things done. You can't get some things done. But again, it's a presidential system. You can get lots of things done, And look at some of the reforms that have been passed. The tax reform, great. Okay. Taxing rich people in Colombia, great, fine. How do you implement that? How do you tax the wealth? How do you find the wealth? You need institutions for that. What happened to tax revenue after they passed that legislation? It went down, exactly. So that just shows you that bribing people to pass legislation is not the magic wand that perhaps President Petro is saying it is.
Y en términos, digamos, de crecimiento, aquí hay toda la discusión de si hay que cambiar el modelo económico. Entonces, ese es otro tema. Yo sé que tú estás más y han trabajado más en el por qué no se crean instituciones para crear crecimiento económico, pero aquí tenemos un presidente y también hay otros presidentes que están diciendo eso, que incluso son de izquierda, que hay que cambiar el modelo económico. No lo dice Lula, no lo dice el presidente de Chile, pero lo dice Petro, que hay que cambiar el modelo económico para volverlo más cercano o por lo menos más amigable con el cambio climático, en fin. ¿Eso tiene algo que ver con la necesidad de que nosotros salgamos de los problemas que tenemos? Sí.
I think that's a genuine discussion about the role of the market or the private sector or the role of the state. I think, if you think about experiences of successful economic development, at least, many of the recent ones have had a powerful role of the state in kind of guiding investment and economic development and planning and, okay, fine. But in all those cases, that's done through very well-functioning institutions, whether it's in Japan, whether it's in South Korea, it's in Taiwan. Those institutions don't exist in Colombia. So it's okay to say, yes, in some contexts, the state has played a powerful role in driving economic change. And that's right, okay? But you have to think about the context. Where are the institutions that are going to make that happen in Colombia? I don't see that. I really don't see it. What I see in Colombia is there is a very sophisticated, globalized private sector. They're very focused on rent seeking and monopolies and getting favors from the government, and that, for me, that has to be rebooted, that relationship. And then there's a lot of capacity. That's actually exactly what they did in South Korea in the 1960s and 1970s in Taiwan. They rebooted the relationship between the state and the private sector. Yeah, the state, but the state helped and the state could help, but you need a real strategy and that needs to be really well thought through how that's going to, you can't just declare, an alternative economic model. That needs a lot of planning and substance. And, if that exists, in Colombia at the moment, I haven't seen it.
No, tampoco yo, desafortunadamente. Pero hablando de otra de las cosas que son importantes las instituciones, es que las instituciones sirven para que la democracia tenga sus checks and balances, que funcione esos checks and balances. Entonces, que haya una fiscalía, que tenga la posibilidad de hacer y ejercer sus investigaciones, que haya una independencia de la rama judicial y que el Congreso también sea independiente. Ya hablamos del clientelismo que hay entre la presidencia del Estado Central y el Congreso. ¿Qué pasa con los otros poderes del Estado, que son partes claves para que esos checks and balances funcionen? ¿Qué pasa en estos países de América Latina. Estamos viendo lo que sucede en México. Los jueces, por una decisión que pasó AMLO, propuesta por AMLO, van a ser elegidos de ahora en adelante por voto popular. ¿Qué significa eso? Y Petro también lo propuso. Aquí, en una discusión, lo propuso en Twitter, creo. ¿Qué pasa en ese campo de las instituciones políticas?
Yeah. Well, I think we, why nations fail. We look at the history of this sort of thing in Latin America. We make this comparison between Roosevelt and Perón. Actually, Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s proposed abolishing the independence of the Supreme Court. Basically, he did all sorts of naughty things, Roosevelt. He violated these two-term limit that George Washington had set, the late 18th century. But people opposed it. People defended the institutions. And in Argentina, Perón proposed packing the Supreme Court, and everyone cheered him on, and the independence of the Supreme Court disappeared in Argentina. And I think everyone can agree that was a disaster. Now every Argentine president picks their own Supreme Court justices. Okay, so I think again it's the same as with bribing congressmen to pass your legislation. It's a sort of It's the tension between short-run expediency. Oh, these people are opposing me, like I need to get them out of the way, But that's what happens in a democracy. People have different opinions, and we debate, and we argue, and we contradict each other. But that way we learn. We learn about what's possible, what works, what doesn't work. I think that's how democracy works. And of course, you're in power and you want to get things done. That gets frustrating. But I think you have to look at the big picture, and you have to say, if I'm going to achieve anything, then I have to deal with this, because this is part of a successful society. What happened in Argentina when Perón destroyed the independence of those institutions? What is going to happen in Mexico when President López Obrador destroys the independence of these institutions? It's going to be a disaster. I think what happened in Venezuela when President Chavez destroyed the independence of these institutions? He impoverished the country. Millions of Venezuelans fled. What kind of society is this? So I think if you just look at history and you look at the facts, you see where that ends.
Y eso es lo que está sucediendo en este momento en Estados Unidos. ¿Qué está pasando en Estados Unidos? Porque yo siempre quería preguntarte a ti, porque he leído todo lo que lees, lo que uno hace, las investigaciones que ustedes hacen. Es evidente que hay un elemento nuevo que es, hay un presidente que se llama Donald Trump, es un presidente que tiene el poder hoy del Congreso, de las dos cámaras, pero además de la Corte Suprema de Justicia, que es una institución muy importante, en los Estados Unidos. ¿Eso es nuevo? ¿Eso qué significa? ¿O eso va a afectar, digamos, en un país que tiene un gran crecimiento económico, el tema de las instituciones? ¿Cómo va a ser esa relación?
Well, I think, what we argue in Why Nations Fail, I think, is that although, there's moments like in the 1930s where institutions in the United States have been challenged, and in the 19th century, in the period of the robber barons and very large increases in inequality and a lot of political corruption, the system has been able to kind of respond to that, Yeah, and I think it's good to remind ourselves that, the Constitution was written for Donald Trump. Like James Madison says in the Federalist Papers, if men were angels, there'd be no need for a Constitution. So men are not angels. That's why we need a Constitution. So I think, for me, if I compare the United States to Colombia, it's interesting to compare the U.S. constitutional process where everyone, many different factions were represented in Philadelphia, and then the Constitution had to be ratified state by state. In Rio Negro, only the liberals turned up,
Yes, no.
And there was no process of ratification, or there was no inclusive process.
It was una constitución impuesta.
Yeah. So if you want to know why the U.S. Constitution has been more durable than the Colombian constitutions, there's a reason. So I think, we have federalism. I think federalism turned out to be very important. The votes get counted by people appointed by by states. Governments, not the federal government. So there's limits. So I think it's a massive problem for the institutions. But for me, here's how I would think about it. I think, President Trump, he's very popular. He won the election. There are a lot of problems in the United States. The majority of people in the United States are no better off now than they were 50 years ago. People are unhappy, and there are reasons to be unhappy. So he's somehow understood that in a way that the traditional political class didn't. I don't know how he understood that, because he was a TV personality or he met ordinary people. Maybe Hillary Clinton never met ordinary people, but okay, but here's the problem. Most of his policies don't address any of these problems. These problems in the United States are not caused by immigrants, illegal or otherwise. So you're going to spend all this time and energy deporting hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants. It's not going to solve any of the problems. So putting tariffs on China, it's maybe Mexico. No, come on. So I think he doesn't really have policies that solve the problems. He's going to cut taxes for corporations and rich people. It's not going to solve the problem. So in 4 years' time, he's going to be very unpopular. Then what happens? He sees that you can't lose an election and then fix it. That didn't work before. So now he'll have to fix the election before the election. Can he do that? I don't know. So that's when the challenge is going to come. I always think, if you look at what Perón did, or if you look at what Chavez did, Chavez couldn't have done that, or Maduro couldn't do that without the support of the military. I think if you look at most countries around the world like that, you can't do it without the support of the military. So I think the independence of the military in the United States at this point maybe is an even stronger kind of defender of the institutions than, it's federalism and the military for me, that I don't think the military will act to keep President Trump in power. But
esto es una posición muy optimista que te agradecemos, James, porque en este momento hay mucha gente pesimista cuando ve lo que pasa en los Estados Unidos, y parece como si se estuviera convirtiendo en una república bananera. Hay veces uno siente. Pero bueno, volviendo ya y finalizando aquí, uno entiende que en Colombia, por ejemplo, nunca ha habido un dictador. Pues ha habido un dictador que duró 4 años, que fue puesto además por la clase política, que es el general Rojas. O sea que la vida institucional, si se puede decir esa palabra, no creo que te guste a ti, pero la vida, digamos, la democracia formal en Colombia nunca se ha roto realmente, pero somos uno de los países, como bien lo analizas tú, más desiguales del mundo, sino el mayor, y uno de los más inequitativos. En educación, en salud, en todo lo que tú tienes, tú has sido un gran cuestionador de los estratos, me acuerdo, de los estratos. ¿En qué país del mundo hay estratos? No sé, tú me vas a decir. Y entonces llega un presidente que es de izquierda, tú dices que la izquierda en el fondo no es lo que importa, ni la derecha, y esta sed de cambio que continuamente aparece y que apareció en estas últimas elecciones, de alguna manera va a quedar truncada si este gobierno no logra de verdad hacer un cambio, y parece que se ha ido quedando en las mismas prácticas que utilizaron los otros. ¿Cómo ves tú a Colombia hoy con Gustavo Petro, 4 años, la gente diciendo, uy, qué susto, él se va a quedar, la gente de derecha, diciendo, qué susto se va a quedar, y frente a las perspectivas en las regiones, o sea, qué pasa en las otras regiones y en el mundo? Ya para finalizar, yo sé que es una pregunta muy larga,
sí,
pero we can cut y decir por lo menos qué pasa a nivel regional, qué representa Gustavo Petro, si no representa nada, y si realmente va a haber o no ese cambio, teniendo en cuenta esta anomalía de Colombia, de que sigue siendo un país que no tiene dictaduras, pero tiene una democracia muy desigual.
I think, yes, I mean, I do think there is this long democratic tradition in Colombia, but it's been kind of managed. So it's, and I think, you're raising a very interesting question also, which is, the kind of deep sort of sociological structure of society. When I illustrate this in my lectures, I always show a photograph of the 3rd floor of Cachivaches with the maid's uniform section, because there is this element of kind of hierarchy and sort of deference and inequality, which is kind of deeply cultural in any Latin American country. It's not just Colombia. I always like the Mexican film Roma, where the grandmother takes the lady to the hospital and she doesn't know what her name is. It's like they ask, and su apellido? No, she doesn't know what her last name is. So I think that how do you change that? And I think trying to change that is what you need to really increase social mobility, to kind of untap all the potential of this society, because people are locked into these relationships of deference and hierarchy, and they never realize their true potential, for me. But how do you, again, that's something you can change in a generation, but how do you do that? I think that's, how do you, I think maybe that's partly to do with representation of very different people at the national level, Afro-Colombians and indigenous people, and, trying to, but that takes, I'm not sure anyone has thought that through either, that transformation. I think that means investing in education. I mean, I'm all in favor of more universities in this country, but a university is an institution. How do you guarantee the university is going to work well? Where does the faculty come from? How do you create standards? You can't just declare, I'm going to build 30 universities. You're going to build a university in the Catatumbo. Okay, great. How's that going to work? How is the quality going to be there? How is that going to change people's lives? And so I think that's the kind of thing, if I thought about countries I know well, and I go, hundreds of years, like Western European society, that is investing in education. It's about, it's about changing attitudes, and attitudes change slowly. And, we still have an upper class and lots of elites in England, but they became irrelevant, So how do you make these people irrelevant? They're going to be there and you have to live with them, but you need to make them irrelevant, and you need to unlock all that energy and talent in this society. I don't know that you can do that it's a cultural project. I always like...
It's a cultural project.
It's a cultural
more
project.
Than political project.
Yes, it's a cultural project.
Es un proyecto cultural, no un proyecto político, sino un proyecto de cambio de la sociedad, de su forma de ser y de ver las cosas. ¿Y tú crees que el hecho de que, digamos, esta sed de cambio necesita... la pregunta que hago es que mucha gente de la derecha siente que Gustavo Petro se va a quedar, que estamos acabando con este país porque ha tenido muchos problemas la implementación del gobierno, ha tenido muchísimos problemas, corrupción, clientelismo, pero la pregunta es, ¿qué va a pasar después de estos 4 años?
Yeah.
O sea,
But their governments were corrupt and clientelistic too. That's why he's in power.
Ellos no se acuerdan de eso.
That's why he's in power. Like this, the big fact is this country has been extremely badly governed for hundreds of years, by the same people who are criticizing Gustavo Petro, So give the guy a break, like, but not for too long, because
Él tiene que hacer las cosas porque está usando los mismos métodos, que eso es lo que la gente que votó por Petro, y yo lo digo porque eso pasó así, está muy descontenta porque está haciendo lo mismo que hicieron nosotros. Pero,
I tell him, I think he should read, if my advice to him would be to read, he'd probably hate this, but read President Uribe's autobiography, because that way he has 2 years to kind of find a way of really showing people that the country is changing. Antanas Mockus did the same thing. I remember when Antanas Mockus came, and he had his strategy for reclaiming public spaces. Very visible. Everyone was talking about it. Everybody went out to the park for the first time in decades, and people stopped at red lights for the first, and so, but he showed people that things were changing, and they were. And so like, what's his strategy for doing that? Like, that's what I'd like to know.
Nosotros también. Esa es una de las cosas. Agradezco, James, esta oportunidad que nos das de poder hablar y de hacer esta conversación. Y thank you very much. Va a estar aquí haciendo una cantidad de cosas muy importantes, ¿no es verdad? y ojalá vuelva a Colombia.
Un placer.
A Fondo es un podcast producido por Mafialand. Producción general, Beatriz Acevedo. Producción de audio, Daniel Chávez Mora. Música original del maestro Óscar Acevedo. Nos pueden escuchar también en mi canal de YouTube. Gracias por escuchar. Soy María Jimena Duzán.